Hello, this is Judith Marder, Head of Languages at the Frankfurt School, with the first of the webinars in the course Intercultural Communication, part of the module Language and Communication for the Semester Abroad. In the first session of the course, you will have talked about culture in general. Of course, almost everyone will have some idea of what they mean by the term culture, and how far we are influenced by our culture in our lives, and especially when communicating with those we perceive to be of a different culture to ours. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to give you some information about how scholars have attempted to research, analyse and define culture. There have been many different ways of doing this, but we are focusing here only on those we feel have been the most influential. It's up to you to decide how far these approaches help you when dealing with different cultures, and in potentially difficult situations, so-called critical incidents. By the next session of the course, we would like you to think about the information you receive here and how far you agree with these approaches to analysing culture and cultures. So, how far can we describe or even define a culture? Cultures can be regarded as national, corporate, or even something else. For example, student culture, city culture. What is said here may apply to all these, although research is usually focused on one specific type. Although there have been many different ways of looking at cultures, most experts agree on the following. Culture is learnt. We're not born with a culture in our genes. Culture is shared. There must be others who have the same or similar views and behaviour as me for these to be regarded as part of my culture. Culture is unconscious. It's only when we're confronted with aspects of our culture, in whatever situation, that we start to think about it. Culture is dynamic. However we define it, it's constantly changing. And culture is emotionally binding. We feel drawn to those who share the same culture as ourselves. So, whatever culture we're looking at, national, corporate or something else, they can all be distinguished by the following, and it is in these ways that we usually describe them. Perceptual elements, the way we think about and see the world. Patterns of cognition, how we think about things. Verbal behaviour, the language we speak and the type of language we use. For instance, what we consider as polite or formal, which are not the same thing. And also, of course, non-verbal behaviour, what we do when we greet someone, what gestures we use, and what we see as appropriate body language. There are also material objects. You will associate the picture you see here with a culture of some type, Russian, communist, imperial, religious. Now think about any culture you are familiar with and how it differs from others in terms of all these things. Cultures have been described by different scholars in different ways, often depending on the discipline they come from. Anthropologists often study cultures in terms of images, pictures and symbols, i.e. what can be seen as specific to a culture. Anthropologists, and also of course historians, see cultures in terms of their history. Incidentally, the words story and history are often the same word, in German, French, Spanish and other languages. In English we have two different words, but also linked, history, story, which show how closely the two are connected. In fact, we often use stories and anecdotes to describe cultural differences and difficulties, such as a story about a business partner coming late to a meeting in Italy, to indicate different views of punctuality. Another way of looking at cultures is in terms of quantitative frameworks. Some of the most famous and influential cultural scholars of the last century applied methods used in science and in psychology to analyse, define and describe cultures. Whether these findings reflect cultural reality is a question now often asked. But whatever criticisms we may have of the methods and the findings, there is no denying the influence of the scholars we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. If you want to know more about them, the Intercultural Communication Reader, which is available in the library, has excerpts from their most influential works. Whether you agree with their methods and findings or not, it's important to know how they and others worked, and what they found about cultures, as this is, even today, the background to much work in HR and expatriate assignment training. The big names in intercultural academic literature are Edward T. Hall, Gert Hofstede and his son Gert Jan Hofstede, and Fons Trompenaars and Charles Hampton Turner. You can see the covers of their perhaps most well-known books here. Edward Hall was an American anthropologist who worked for the Peace Corps and the US State Department and travelled widely. His methods were largely anthropological. That is, he used qualitative methods, including his own observations and others' narratives of experience, that is, stories, to identify 3 dimensions, by means of which he maintained cultures can be distinguished from one another. These 3 dimensions are useful for seeing how different cultures and individuals see things, and that there is nothing which we can say is normal. The dimension of proxemics describes how personal space is regarded in different cultures, how much is needed, and how far apart people stand from each other when communicating in different situations. Polychronic and monochronic time describes attitudes to time, whether it is seen as something fixed or as something flexible, manifested, for example, in whether several actions are carried out one at a time or simultaneously, and in the importance of punctuality. The dimension of high and low context is one which has proved particularly useful in understanding communication styles. Hall identified high context cultures as those where much is understood implicitly, and communication depends highly on mutual understanding of the context, without the need to express this. In low context cultures, information and facts are expressed largely with words, and if something is not stated, it is usually not an important part of the message. The pictures you can see in this slide indicate that Asian cultures are often considered high context, and European, and particularly North American, as low context. It's important, however, to remember that the concepts of high and low context are always relative. You may like to think about the reasons for criticism of Hall's methods and findings. One of Hall's critics was Gert Hofstede from Holland, who, we could say, won the intercultural theory race and is still very widely quoted today. His view of culture is expressed in the quotation you can see on the slide. Culture is the collective programming of the mind. Hofstede worked for IBM and conducted his large-scale research project with IBM staff in many different countries. He used methods established in psychology. That is, he asked predefined questions in self-answer questionnaires, and on the basis of the answers, he identified 5 and later 6 dimensions, by means of which cultures can be distinguished. You can find out more about the dimensions on his website, the address of which is given here. However, as is usual in the academic world, he was also criticized, and one of his foremost critics was his own student, Fons Trompenaars. Fons Trompenaars, also from Holland, along with a colleague, Charles Hampton Turner, a British management philosopher, also defined cultural dimensions, this time 7, on the basis of psychological methods. Their methods were similar to Hofstede's, but they also included scenarios, and their context was the company Shell. The dimensions developed by Trompenaars and Hampton Turner are slightly different to Hofstede's, but with some similarities, and they also produced lists of country rankings for each of the dimensions. You can see the similarities between the findings more clearly on the next slide. The reason you should know about these researchers is that they have been very influential, especially in academic circles, and so they are often quoted. Whatever shortcomings they may have, their findings have certainly helped to raise awareness of the differences between cultures. Please think a little about what this research and the findings may mean, and how these dimensions might help you to understand a culture. The researchers we have talked about were not the only ones. There are more, including wide-ranging surveys such as the European Values Study and the World Values Survey, which described cultures using different terms from Hall, Hofstede and Trompenaars, and used methods taken from social research, as opposed to anthropology or psychology. On this slide, the dimensions which are often found useful and most often mentioned are outlined in red. Others are printed in black and purple. Can you identify the difference in the nature of the black and the purple dimensions? One thing all these dimensions have in common is that they categorize cultures in various ways, which has led users to believe that cultures are static and monolithic. This can be a dangerous assumption, and recent views show that this is definitely not the case. Hofstede made the claim that a culture takes 100 years to change. What is your view on this, based on cultures you are familiar with? There have been several other criticisms, one or two of which we will indicate here. We would then ask you to think critically about these research methods and the findings. In developing his dimensions, Gert Hofstede asked questions based on psychological constructs, using the answers to rank national cultures by number, producing an index for the dimension. One example is uncertainty avoidance, which is the degree to which uncertainty can be tolerated and how much uncertainty is acceptable. To quote from Hofstede's website, "The uncertainty avoidance dimension expresses the degree to which the members of a society feel uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. The fundamental issue here is how a society deals with the fact that the future can never be known. Should we try to control the future or just let it happen?" How many questions would you ask to define the level of uncertainty avoidance in a culture? Hofstede decided on and asked 3 questions in his questionnaire to define the dimension of uncertainty avoidance and all the other dimensions. Many of the questions are not published, but these 3 are. What are your views on using questions like this to identify how a culture sees uncertainty? Do you think you can base a universal cultural dimension on the answers given to 3 questions? In science, results of research are often compared with other findings to validate them. Taking the example of uncertainty avoidance, how would you try and see if these findings about national culture may be true? Here are Hofstede's findings for 3 countries, France, Germany and the UK. Can you imagine why many, French and other cultural researchers don't agree? Can you think of any hard facts which may support these findings on uncertainty avoidance or disprove them? Another criticism of quantitative frameworks is that the indices and ranking are based on the concept of a nation-state representing a culture. This table for long-term orientation shows the list of countries and how they're ranked. There is a list like this for each of the dimensions identified by Hofstede. Let's look at India. Anyone who knows anything about India will know that there is very little similarity between the state, yellow in the far north, Jammu Kashmir, and the state, purple, on the southwest coast, Kerala. The differences between these 2 states in terms of language, religion, food, not to mention weather, means that they can hardly be regarded as belonging to one culture. India is a big country, but if you think about almost any country you know, however large or small, you will probably find that the same applies. In fact, size has little to do with it, as you can see on the next slide. This is a country nearer home, which we hope you can identify, and which most agree is made up of at least 4 different groups, each of which may be regarded as having a distinctive culture. This brings us to the first point to remember. Whatever findings about culture you use to learn about a culture, and however helpful they are, you never meet a culture, but always an individual. In general, this means that cultural dimensions should be considered less as hard facts than as possibly helpful information for general orientation, something which becomes clearer on the next slide. As already said, studies of cultures may be helpful, but you should always bear in mind that the map is not the territory. Maps are essential for general orientation, but they do not really tell you what the reality of a place is. You can only find this out by being there and experiencing it yourself. It's also important to remember that different types of maps, street maps, geological maps, climate maps, maps showing restaurants, are more or less necessary and useful depending on what you need to know. In the same way, your own cultural research should be based on several different findings and not rely on just one set of dimensions. One definition we find helpful, and which shows the close connection between culture and language and why this course is situated in the module Language and Communication, is from the British anthropologist Brian Street. Culture is a verb. As we always need to start to understand different cultures, research findings may be useful. But at the same time, particularly because they are made up of people, cultures cannot be regarded as static and unchanging, and should rather be seen as fuzzy and constantly being recreated through communication. The image you see on this slide is one you may be talking about in the course, so you might like to think about what it has to do with culture. Clearly, we cannot communicate at all, and least of all about culture, without using language. Languages open doors to the world, and depending on which language you speak, you will get a slightly different view of the world. We cannot deal with intercultural experience and avoid and solve difficulties without language. Even with a common language, much will remain hidden, aptly put by Edward Hall in the quotation you can read here. We've now reached the end of the first webinar and would ask you to think about some of the questions raised and your views on the research into cultures which has been described. Thank you for listening.